Good morning. Are you self-employed and wondering what happens to your solo 401k once you decide to hang up your hat and retire? Does the plan shut down? Can you still keep your investments? And what about distributions? Are they taxed or can you roll them somewhere else? These are some of the biggest questions we hear from solo 401k owners. We are going to unpack all this during today's daily webinar. As always, go ahead and type over your questions during the live webinar, and we'll pause and answer those questions as they come in. Please also like today's video, subscribe to our YouTube channel to help get the word out to other solopreneurs like yourself. We typically go live at least once a day, many times, twice a day. You can visit our YouTube video catalog. We have over 900 videos. I think it's fast approaching 950, where we've covered all aspects of retirement accounts. So take a look at that catalog. You can also visit our community. That's where we have over 30,000 members that are constantly posting forums. If you're a financial professional or CPA, attorney, or even an insurance agent, or for that matter, any type of professional, you can post guest blog posts on our community to help educate our community members. We can even link back to your company website so that our members can see what services you offer, and heck, they may even utilize some of your services. And it's free to join. You can also visit our artificial intelligence site, which is www.solo401k.ai. So as you can see, we are very active in the retirement account communities, especially for those who are self-employed. You can ask questions today regarding any topic. It doesn't have to be specific to today's topic, which is what happens to a solo 401k when you retire. You can also ask questions about self-directed IRAs, traditional 401ks, and even the rollover business startup 401k, known as the business financing 401k. And we'll pause and answer those questions as they come in. And in the meantime, let's get started with today's topic. We get this question quite a bit. So what are your options when you retire? Do you have to close the plan down, for instance? Can you continue with the solo 401k plan? So here are some of the key topics that we'll cover today. Require minimum distributions at age 73. So require minimum distributions is, just as the word require implies, that's when you have to start making distributions from your solo 401k plan, specifically pre-tax solo 401k funds, not the Roth solo 401k funds. So just like Roth IRAs, Roth solo 401k plans are not subject to require minimum distributions. Just the pre-tax solo 401k funds, which is in line with traditional IRAs, SEP IRAs, and simple IRAs, which are also subject to require minimum distributions. Here's the big one here. Can you keep your solo 401k open in retirement? So the answer is yes, you can. In other words, just because you're retired doesn't mean you cannot continue with the solo 401k plan. When we think of retirement, we think of you no longer working for a full-time employer. Let's say you used to work for NVIDIA and you retire from working from NVIDIA or even Walmart. So obviously, once you're retired, from Nvidia or Walmart, you can still continue with that 401k that Nvidia or Walmart offers, because by you retiring, that doesn't mean that Nvidia and Walmart are closing their doors. Well, with a solo 401k plan, even if you retire from your daytime employer, you can still participate in a solo 401k plan if you're doing some moonlighting on the side. Oftentimes, when individuals retire, especially nowadays, they don't want to just sit around and let their savings dwindle or their mental health dwindle. So they like to work, whether it's a few hours a week to maybe 10, 20 hours a year or maybe more. So as long as you're doing some type of self-employment activity, even though you retire, per se retire, meaning you don't have to go to a 8 to 5 job anymore, but now you can work on your schedule. As long as you have some type of self-employment activity, you can continue with your solo 401k plan, and you're not required to make contributions to that solo 401k plan. So whether you are working full-time for your self-employed business or part-time, you're not required to make contributions to a solo 401k plan, because a solo 401k plan is a defined contribution plan. It's not a defined benefit plan. Defined benefit plans are ones where you have to make contributions every year, and it's actually made up of employer contributions, but not to get too off topic here. So again, the question is, can you keep your solo 401k open in retirement? Again, the answer is yes, as long as you're doing some type of freelancing on the side, and it can be a few hours a year, or few hours a week. You just got to make sure you're doing some material services. All right. Now, let's say that you have retired and you don't want to have a solo 401k plan anymore. And moreover, let's say you're not going to perform any self-employment activity. Well, in that instance, you would need to close your solo 401k plan down, because in order to have a solo 401k plan, you have to have a business tied to it. Going back to my Nvidia and Walmart example, if Nvidia and Walmart closes their doors, they can no longer sponsor a 401k, because you have to have a business tied to the 401k. Same thing with the self-employed individual. If you no longer have a business, then you can no longer sponsor a solo 401k plan. So the key is that you have a self-employed business that can sponsor the plan. Looks like we've got a question here. Let's take a look at that, and then we'll come back here and keep going over today's topic, which is what happens to a solo 401k when you retire? Can we convert pre-tax solo 401k into Roth solo 401k when we decide to retire? Great question. Yes. When you retire, you can certainly convert your pre-tax solo 401k funds to the Roth solo 401k, assuming you're going to continue to do some type of self-employment activity on the side. Or you can convert it to a Roth IRA, because when you're over age 59 and a half, you can convert pre-tax solo 401k funds to a Roth IRA or to the Roth solo 401k plan. But again, in order to continue with the solo 401k plan, there has to be a business tied to it. That's a very important requirement. Good question. So we're talking about some options once you permanently cease self-employment activity. So one option is to close down that solo 401k plan and transfer it to a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA if you also have Roth funds in that solo 401k. Otherwise, you can take a full taxable distribution, which of course you're not going to want to do, especially if you have pre-tax funds in the solo 401k plan. And even if you have Roth solo 401k funds, I don't think you want to deplete your Roth solo 401k. So the best option is going to be to transfer it to a Roth IRA. We're going to talk about some tax strategies for withdrawals, and then continue investing and alternative investments like real estate, cryptocurrency, precious metals. A lot of our clients not only like to utilize the solo 401k for various contribution reasons, like making pre-tax solo 401k contributions, Roth solo 401k contributions, as well as voluntary after-tax solo 401k contributions as part of the mega backdoor Roth strategy, but they also like to make alternative investments. And our plan allows for both making traditional investments like equities, stocks, index funds, exchange traded funds, but also those alternative investments like private equity, physical real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, tax liens, promissory notes, the list goes on. Okay, again, go ahead and type over your questions during today's daily webinar, and we'll go ahead and answer those questions as they come in. In the meantime, let's keep going here. So we're talking about what happens to your solo 401k when you retire. So there are certain items you need to consider if you close your plan because you have permanently ceased performing self-employment activity. So you want to consider, okay, does my plan hold both pre-tax 401k funds as well as Roth 401k funds? If so, what happens? What do I need to do? Does the plan have any outstanding solo 401k participant loans? Many of our clients like to borrow from their solo 401k plan through a solo 401k participant loan, and then they pay back the plan based on scheduled monthly or quarterly payments, typically over a 5-year period, or it can be a 15 or 30-year participant loan period if you use the proceeds towards the purchase of your primary residence. So if you have an outstanding loan and you permanently cease being self-employed, so you fully retire, meaning you're not going to do any part-time self-employment activity, and you've got an outstanding loan, you need to determine what happens under that circumstance. Well, one thing I can tell you is you're going to have to pay that loan off. And if you cannot pay that loan off, then the outstanding loan balance will be treated as a taxable distribution if those are made up of pre-tax solo 401k funds. Now, if it's a Roth, if you borrowed from the Roth solo 401k and you don't pay that loan back, it may not be treated, it'll be treated as a distribution, but it may not be taxable. If you've had funds in the Roth solo 401k for 5 years and you are age 59 and a half or over. So those are qualifying events. So that loan, if you cannot pay back and you borrowed it from the Roth solo 401k portion, it may or may not be subject to taxes. Of course, you can never transfer a Roth solo 401k participant loan or a pre-tax solo 401k participant loan to an IRA because IRAs do not allow for loans. Those are only available to certain qualified plans, including a 401k, such as a solo 401k. And again, you got to determine, okay, do I hold any alternative investments in my solo 401k plan, like precious metals, cryptocurrency, physical real estate, private equity? If you hold those types of investments, then you're not going to be able to transfer that solo 401k to what I like to call a regular IRA versus a self-directed IRA. A self-directed IRA is one where, as the words imply, you can self-direct your investments into alternative investments like real estate, cryptocurrency, precious metals, private equity, and so forth. So if your plan holds alternative investments, then you need to make sure you start planning as to what to do with those alternative investments. And we're going to talk about some of your options, including how you can transfer those alternative investments to a self-directed IRA. Okay, I think we may have some more questions here. Let's take a look at those questions here. Good info. We appreciate the feedback. As always, please subscribe to our channel to help get the word out to other solopreneurs like yourself. Please also like today's video. Please also take a look at our YouTube channel where we have a large video catalog. You can visit our community. It's free to join. Take a look at our artificial intelligence page, which is www.solo401k.ai. Okay, let's take a look at some more questions here, and then we'll come back and continue going with through today's slides. So we've got a question here from Ted. I assume we can convert the solo 401k into an existing Roth IRA when I retired, or does it have to be a new Roth IRA account? Good question. You're exactly right. You can transfer it to your existing Roth IRA, or you can open up a new Roth IRA. You would only need to open up a new Roth IRA possibly if you have alternative investments in that solo 401k, like real estate or cryptocurrency. In that Roth IRA you have already may not allow for those type of investments. So you may have to open up a second Roth IRA, a self-directed Roth IRA, or you could transfer your existing Roth IRA to that self-directed Roth IRA. And you can also have multiple Roth IRAs. There's nothing in the regulations that say you cannot have multiple Roth IRAs. I know many clients have multiple IRAs out there that they oftentimes consolidate. Okay, good question. So looks like we have another question here from Barry. We've got a question here. If you contribute after-tax amounts to a 401k account that already has pre-tax contributions, can you possibly avoid taxes if just the after-tax contributions are soon rolled over to a Roth IRA? Well, so with respect to after-tax amounts, I assume you're referring to Roth 401k contributions, not voluntary after-tax 401k contributions. If your plan holds Roth 401k funds, those can certainly be transferred to a Roth IRA once you're age 59 and a half or no longer self-employed. Same thing with pre-tax solo 401k funds. Those can be transferred to a traditional IRA once you start being self-employed or if you're age 59 and a half or older. Okay, good question. Let's see. Looks like we have another question here. Would art held in Masterworks need to be sold and the funds transferred to our solo 401k checking account? Well, so again, today's webinar deals with having to close the solo 401k plan. So I'm going to approach your question with that regard. So if your solo 401k plan invested in a private equity, which is my understanding, or a private fund, which is my understanding that that's what Masterworks is that it's a private fund. It's a private equity fund. So that means that your solo 401k owns shares of private units or stock in that private equity fund. So if you start being self-employed, you can transfer that private equity fund in kind to a self-directed IRA. Therefore, you would not have to liquidate that private equity investment. And we're going to shed some more light on that in a minute regarding how to move funds out of a self-directed solo 401k that encompasses alternative investments like private equity, real estate, and so forth. Looks like Barry's clarifying his question here. He's saying that the 401k has voluntary after-tax funds. So let's look at Barry's question here now that he's clarified his question. If I contribute after-tax amounts, so that he's saying voluntary after-tax. He's not referring to Roth 401k funds because those are also made with after-tax funds. If you transfer those from a plan that already has pre-tax contributions, can you simply avoid taxes if just the after-tax contributions are rolled over to a Roth IRA? Well, there are no taxes involved because when you convert the voluntary after-tax solo 401k funds to the Roth solo 401k or the Roth IRA, especially if you convert it right away, there's going to be minimal gains. So whenever you make a voluntary after-tax solo 401k contribution and you want to convert that to the Roth IRA or even the Roth solo 401k plan, you want to convert that immediately. And you're not going to have to touch the funds in your pre-tax bucket, because remember, voluntary after-tax solo 401k funds have to be separately tracked in a separate bucket. Let's take a look at the slide here. So here's an example of a solo 401k plan. This is an example of a one participant plan. Let's say Joe is self-employed in his own sole proprietorship. So he opens a solo 401k plan. So the plan is sponsored by his sole proprietorship, and Joe is going to have multiple holding accounts under that solo 401k plan. It's not going to be three separate solo 401k plans. It's just one plan. When you open a solo 401k company from a company like my solo 401k financial, our plan allows for these contribution types. So pre-tax solo 401k contributions, which are made up of employee and or employer pre-tax contributions, Roth solo 401k contributions, which are made up of employee contributions as well, and even employer contributions resulting from Secure Act 2.0. Now you can apply your employer contributions as Roth solo 401k contributions. And the third bucket is voluntary after-tax solo 401k contributions. So one plan that allows for these various contribution types. And you're going to need at least three separate brokerage accounts or bank accounts under that solo 401k plan to hold these various contribution amounts. Because a solo 401k is a defined contribution plan. Therefore, the IRS requires that you have separate holding accounts, aka bank or brokerage accounts, to hold each source. Therefore, when you make a voluntary after-tax solo 401k contribution, that's not going to impact your pre-tax funds bucket, because those are separately tracked. When you make that contribution to the voluntary after-tax solo 401k bucket, and you go to process the conversion, where you convert those voluntary after-tax solo 401k funds to the Roth solo 401k or a Roth IRA, just this voluntary after-tax solo 401k is impacted. So you are required to transfer all the funds in that voluntary after-tax solo 401k bucket. So if you convert those funds right away, there won't be any gains. So when you convert those over, that will not be a taxable event. Of course, when you make that voluntary after-tax solo 401k contribution, you won't get a deduction for that. So it's not going to reduce your taxable income for the year. But the trade-off is that now you can convert it to the Roth solo 401k or the Roth IRA and indirectly get more Roth 401k money into your solo 401k, or more Roth IRA money into your Roth IRA. So good question. Okay. Another question here from Ted. Can security stocks be transferred from Fidelity solo 401k to a Roth account when we close the solo 401k? Or do the securities need to be sold and the funds transferred? We'll talk more about that question. But to answer your question, the answer is yes. You can transfer those securities in kind directly from the Roth solo 401k to that Roth IRA. In other words, you will not need to liquidate your securities. And we'll talk more about that. Looks like Barry's got another question. Pro rata. No, the pro rata rule does not apply to solo 401k plans. I'm glad you brought that up. And again, we actually did a webinar on this a couple days ago. And if you go to our YouTube channel where we have over 900 videos, you can pull up that webinar. I probably spent 30 minutes just talking about the pro rata rule. So go to our YouTube channel and take a look at that, please. But please help spread the word. Pro rata rules only apply to IRAs when you're utilizing when you're utilizing the backdoor Roth IRA. We're talking about the mega backdoor Roth solo 401k, and that's why you have a separate bucket under that solo 401k labeled voluntary after tax. That way, none of your other funds in the pre-tax bucket or Roth bucket are impacted when doing the conversion. So I'm glad you asked. Okay, so let's keep going through our presentation here. So again, we're talking about what happens to a solo 401k when you retire. We've been talking about this topic at a good length already. Let's continue. We already covered this slide here with respect to things to consider. Here we go. What are your options for the solo 401k funds? So once you permanently retire, in other words, you're not going to have a self-employed business anymore, then you have to close the plan. And we already talked about why, because in order to continue with any type of 401k, you have to have a self-employed business attached to it. You can't have a solo 401k or any 401k without a business. So what are your options? Well, one option is to transfer it to an IRA. And this is the most common and efficient, tax efficient option. Let's see if I have a slide that, give me a moment here. So again, one option is to transfer it to an IRA or self-directed IRA. So the rollover process. So let's talk first about a self-directed IRA, and then we'll talk about what I like to call a regular IRA, meaning one that does not allow for alternative investments like real estate, cryptocurrency, precious metals, private equity, and so forth. So if we're talking about a self-directed IRA, which is one that will allow you to transfer your alternative investments held in that solo 401k, then you need to first open a self-directed IRA. There are many trust companies out there that offer self-directed IRAs. One that comes to mind that's very popular is Forge Trust. They're in the San Francisco Bay Area. They offer self-directed IRAs. So you can open a self-directed IRA with Forge Trust, for example. That's the first thing you want to do. And then after that, you need to transfer your cash and alternative investments to that self-directed IRA. So if we're talking about a private equity fund or some type of real estate fund, like a real estate syndicate, that investment would need to be assigned from the solo 401k, because keep in mind, when you invest that solo 401k in that private equity fund, the solo 401k name needs to be listed on that subscription agreement for that private equity fund. So when you go to transfer that solo 401k out, that private equity investment to the self-directed IRA, it's going to need to be assigned from the name of the solo 401k to the name of the self-directed IRA trust company for the benefit of your IRA. So you would work with the investment sponsor of that private equity or real estate syndicate and having them update their records to now reflect that the owner is a self-directed IRA. And then you will provide a copy of that subscription agreement to the self-directed IRA custodian so that they can sign off approving having that private equity investment held in that self-directed IRA. And then there's going to have to be some type of assignment prepared where it's going to show that the solo 401k equity investment has been assigned to the self-directed IRA. So first you need to open up the self-directed IRA, then transfer cash as well as the alternative investments. Now, if we're talking about a physical real estate property, let's say a rental property, then you're going to have to, so again, let's say the solo 401k holds a rental property. That rental property will need to be assigned from the self-directed solo 401k. So the recorded deed should be reflecting the solo 401k as the owner of that property. So you would work with the county recorder to have that property granted from the solo 401k plan directly to the self-directed IRA custodian. You then send the recorded deed, the updated recorded deed, to the self-directed IRA custodian, who will hold it in their vault. So they'll secure it in their vault. So now it'll be held in the self-directed IRA. And then once you've transferred those alternative investments to that self-directed IRA, the solo 401k plan provider will issue a Form 1099-R and a Form 5500 Easy. Both of those are required to formally close the solo 401k with the government. And if you're a client of my solo 401k financial, we'll shepherd you through this entire closing process. We have thousands of clients, and you can imagine that many of them end up transferring their funds out because they cease self-employment activity. So here at my solo 401k financial, we'll issue that Form 1099-R and 5500 easy if you timely request it, and we'll file those electronically with the government. So we make it very easy for you, and we'll even help you work with your self-directed IRA custodian and making sure that the alternative investments held in that solo 401k plan get properly assigned to that self-directed IRA. So these are the items you need to keep in mind if you have alternative investments in your self-directed solo 401k, that you would need to open a self-directed IRA. Now, if you only hold equities and cash in your solo 401k, then you don't have to open a self-directed IRA. You can open up a regular IRA, like an IRA at Fidelity Investments. And then it would be a very similar process. You would open up an IRA at Fidelity Investments and then transfer your cash to that IRA at Fidelity. And then the equities would also get transferred to that Fidelity IRA. We would help you fill out Fidelity's transfer form, for instance, so those funds get transferred into Fidelity. So the assets, the stocks, index funds, exchange traded funds don't get liquidated, even bond funds. So they would get picked up and moved to the Fidelity IRA. And then we would need to issue the Form 5500 easy and Form 1099-R to formally close the plan with the government if you're a client of my solo 401k financial. So hopefully that answers that question that we had earlier from Ted right there. Okay, let's see here. If it's actually this question right here. Again, please go ahead and continue to type over your questions during today's daily webinar. Today's topic is what happens to a solo 401k when you retire? So we've been talking about that topic at great length. Let's continue here. Let's see here. Let's take a look at the next slide here. So we were looking at this slide here. We already covered how it can be transferred to an IRA if you're no longer self-employed. Now, another option here is that you could actually transfer that solo 401k to a traditional 401k. Let's say you used to work for a full-time employer. Let's say you used to work for Best Buy or Microsoft or Kaiser Permanente or any company out there. You can transfer your solo 401k to that former employer's 401k if you still have a 401k with that former employer. And that may be advantageous for you, as a matter of fact, especially if your solo 401k plan does not hold any alternative investments. That might be advantageous for you from a creditor protection, because IRAs are not protected from general creditors at the federal level. Creditor protection for IRAs falls at the state level. And when I'm talking about general creditors, I'm not talking about bankruptcy creditors, but general creditors. If someone tries to sue you, for instance, they can technically come after your IRA funds, depending on your state of residence. Because again, protection from general creditors for IRAs fall at the state level, whereas for 401ks, full-time employer 401ks, those are fully protected from both general creditors and bankruptcy creditors at the federal level. So that's an instance where I see individuals who are no longer self-employed transfer their solo 401k to a former employer 401k. Obviously, if you no longer have a former employer 401k, then you don't have that option. And of course, the last resort, if you have to close your solo 401k plan, is to take a distribution. Well, that's why it's called a last resort option, because that could trigger taxes and penalties, especially on your pre-tax solo 401k funds, not necessarily your Roth solo 401k funds, depending whether it's a qualified distributions versus a non-qualified distribution. But I don't think you're going to want to liquidate your hard-earned Roth solo 401k funds. You may want to pass those to your beneficiaries upon your death, whether it's your spouse beneficiary or your children as the beneficiary. All right. And again, don't make the mistake of not filing the required forms to close a solo 401k plan down. I can count so many instances where individuals have closed their solo 401k plan without telling us. And they think, okay, well, I've closed this plan down. I'm all set. Then they communicate to us a year or 2 years later, and they tell us, and I tell them, guess what? You didn't finish the job. You're required to file a Form 1099-R and a 5500 easy to formally close a plan down. And clients will say, well, the plan was under $250,000 in value, so that's why I didn't file a 5500 easy. Well, guess what? That only applies if you have an active plan where if the market value of that plan is less than 250,000 as of the end of the plan year, assuming you don't also have other self-employed plans like a defined benefit plan, then you are correct. You don't have to file Form 5500 easy. However, that same requirement cannot be applied when closing a solo 401k plan. You are required to file a final 5500 easy to close that plan, regardless of market value when it's closed. And the IRS charges $250 per day for non-filing, and that compounds. So you could easily have a few $100,000 penalty for not filing a 5500 easy. So if you haven't filed a 5500 easy for that closed plan, you better come clean and file it on under what the IRS refers to as the penalty relief program. The Form 5500 easy penalty relief program will charge you just $500 to file that final 5500 easy as long as they don't catch it. If they catch it first, before you catch it, then you're not going to be able to file under that penalty relief program. And you're going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's been many years versus just paying $500. So I can't stress enough how when you close a solo 401k plan down, you need to file not only a Form 1099-R, but a final 5500 easy. And the IRS will catch it. It might take them a couple years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, but they're going to catch it eventually. Okay. Oh, here's a good question here. I get this question quite a bit. Does the solo 401k allow for the rule of 55? The answer is no. Solo 401k plans, whether it's a solo 401k plan offered by my solo 401k financial or one offered by Fidelity or any company out there, does not allow for the year of 55 rule. Why? Because the year of 55 rule applies if you separate from service from an employer that offers a 401k. So for example, let's say you work for Microsoft and you separate from Microsoft when you're age 55, separate meaning you no longer work for Microsoft. Under the age of 55 exception, you can take a distribution from that 401k without having to pay a 10% early distribution penalty, which typically applies for those who are age 59 and a half or older. So you still have to pay federal taxes and most likely state taxes depending on your state of residence. Well, when you separate from service for Microsoft, that doesn't mean that Microsoft closes its doors. Therefore, that Microsoft 401k plan continues. So it doesn't apply to a solo 401k plan because when you separate from your employer, your self-employed business, the plan has to be closed down. So the plan automatically has to be transferred to an IRA or you have to take a taxable distribution. So for that reason, you're never going to have a solo 401k plan that allows for the age of 55. Any solo 401k provider out there that tries to tell you that it does, you better, I don't want to say it, but you want to think twice about it. Because again, The rule of 55 does not apply to solo 401k plans, only traditional 401k plans. All right, great question. Okay, let's continue with our webinar here. Go ahead and shoot over your questions while we continue to discuss today's daily topic, which is what happens to a solo 401k when you retire. We've already covered this slide here. Let's see what else we can talk about. We've covered the steps to take as well, but it doesn't hurt to review them. So again, when you're closing a solo 401k plan, you want to determine whether you have any solo 401k participant loans outstanding. You want to make sure that you open up the new IRAs or use your existing IRAs, because you need to have an IRA to transfer your funds into, because the last thing you want to do is take a taxable distribution. And you want to make sure that you perform the required reporting to formally close the plan with the government. Now, here are some of the pros and cons of when you have to close a solo 401k plan. The benefits is that, yes, you're going to be able to preserve your retirement funds, their tax deferred or tax-free status in the case of a Roth solo 401k, by transferring them to an IRA or a Roth IRA. And oftentimes you'll have some expanded investment options if you open up a self-directed IRA versus a traditional IRA. So you'll be able to invest in alternative investments. Some of the drawbacks is that you can't make high contributions because a solo 401k plan allows for high contributions. For example, for tax year 2025, you can contribute as much as $70,000 to a solo 401k, and even an additional $7,500 if you're age 50 or older, or even an additional $11,250 if you're age 60, 61, 62, or 63, because of the super catch-up. And unfortunately, IRAs only allow for minimal contribution amounts, which is $7,000 for tax year 2025, including, or you can do the catch-up amount of $1,000 for a total amount of $8,000 to that IRA, which falls way short versus the contribution limits to a solo 401k. You won't be able to borrow from that IRA because IRAs don't allow for solo 401k participant loans. If you're invested in real estate through that solo 401k that's leveraged, for example, let's say you want to invest in a rental property, you don't have enough funds in that solo 401k, you can utilize what's referred to as a non-recourse loan, where the solo 401k obtains a loan from a third party like a hard money lender or a bank, and it's called a non-recourse loan. That loan goes to the solo 401k, and those funds are used towards the purchase of that rental property. If you utilize that same strategy with the self-directed IRA, yes, it's allowed, but it's not as advantageous because it's going to trigger what's referred to as unrelated debt finance income tax on that IRA investment that was financed through a non-recourse loan. So again, when you're retired, you don't necessarily have to close your solo 401k plan. Again, you might still do some part-time self-employment activity so that you can keep your solo 401k plan. Yes, you may have retired from your daytime employer, but you could still do some moonlighting, so be semi-retired, and you can continue with that solo 401k plan. All right, so good information here. Let's see what else we have. So here are some common questions. I think we've covered these indirectly. Can I still contribute if I do part-time consulting? Yes, you can. So again, you might be semi-retired, and so you can still continue with the solo 401k plan if you're doing some part-time self-employment activity. And the government doesn't come out and say exactly how many hours you have to work. If you refer to IRS publication number 560, which is the IRS publication for self-employed plans, including solo 401k plans, you're going to find language that just points to being that it talks about performing material services. It has that specific language, material services on a part-time basis. It doesn't give it an hour limit. What if my spouse is part of the plan? Great question. So if your spouse is part of the plan, meaning that she's self-employed in your business, then the solo 401k plan can continue. There's an interesting one for you. So let's say you and your spouse are both working in the same self-employed business. Let's say it's an LLC. Let's say it's an LLC taxed as a sole proprietorship. Let's look at the slide here. So if you and your spouse are both self-employed under the same LLC, if you look at this slide here on the right, this is an example of a two-participant plan. So this is an example, let's say where both spouses are self-employed in the same business. So the same self-employed business, let's say it's an LLC. So that LLC will sponsor the solo 401k plan. You and your spouse can both participate in that same solo 401k plan because just like traditional 401k plans are sponsored by the business, same thing with the solo 401k. It's sponsored by the self-employed business. So it's not going to be two separate solo 401k plans. It's going to be just one plan because you're both working in the same business. You're each going to have separate holding accounts under that solo 401k, so separate bank or brokerage accounts to track your respective contributions and funds under the plan, whether it's pre-tax, Roth, or voluntary after tax. So this is an example of one plan that's sponsored by that self-employed business. Both spouses participate in the same plan. You see that they each have separate holding accounts to hold their respective funds. So if, let's say that Janet and Bob are self-employed in an LLC, and let's say that they both participate in the same plan. Let's say that Bob no longer does any more self-employment activity, so he's retired. Well, as long as Bob's spouse, Janet, in this example, is self-employed, then that plan does not have to be closed down. And Bob can actually keep his funds inside that solo 401k plan as well. So you're pretty much piggybacking off your spouse. So that's a big benefit. So Bob can continue with the solo 401k plan, even though he's retired. He won't be able to make any contributions, obviously, but he's still going to be able to make investments. He can transfer IRAs, former employer plans, to the solo 401k plan as well. So that's an example there of where you can continue with the plan even if you retire from the business. Okay, let's see here. So that's a good one there to be mindful of, those that want to keep their plan. Do the rules change for spousal beneficiaries? This is more of a what happens to my solo 401k plan when I pass away. So when you pass away, and if you name your spouse as the primary beneficiary, I mean, by law, your spouse is the primary beneficiary anyways, unless he or she opted out of being the beneficiary. So if your spouse is the primary beneficiary of your solo 401k and you decease, then she's going to be able to transfer those solo 401k funds, those inherited solo 401k funds, to her own IRA. So if there are pre-tax solo 401k funds and Roth solo 401k funds in your plan and you pass away, your spouse can transfer those to her respective Roth IRA and traditional IRAs. Another option is if she's self-employed, she can transfer those to her own solo 401k plan, and now she can continue with her own solo 401k plan. And we've done webinars on that topic in the past, and I'm sure we'll do some more in the future. What happens if I want to roll funds into an IRA? We already went over that at great length. We talked about transferring to a traditional IRA or even to a self-directed IRA. I think we're coming to the end of our session here. Let's go through our slides here to make sure. Looks like we have covered all our slides for today. So again, when you close the solo 401k, before you close it, you want to make sure you confirm eligibility, whether or not you are, in fact, no longer self-employed. And I gave some examples earlier. If you are self-employed, if you are no longer doing self-employment activity and you have to close the plan down, be aware of the types of investments you hold in that plan, whether it's alternative investments or traditional investments, or whether you have an outstanding 401k participant loan. You need to make sure that if you do transfer the funds out, that they're transferred out correctly and that the proper reporting is performed, such as Form 1099-R and the final filing about Form 5500-EZ. All right, looks like we've come to the end of our session. Again, thank you for joining today's daily webinar. Until next time, have a great day.